Welcome to The Mind of a Bee with Lars Chittka. My name is Ronan Crawford-Ellen, and I'm a volunteering project officer for York Cares at the University of York. I want to introduce the speaker today. So, Lars Chittka is Professor of Sensory and Behavioural Ecology at Queen Mary University, London, and the co-editor of Cognitive Ecology of Pollination. We are delighted to welcome Lars tonight to talk about his fascinating book, The Mind of a Bee, which he shares with us his findings from years of research on this amazing creature whose sensory experiences rival those of humans. Lars, over to you.
Here's the book that has just been mentioned. So it's a work about the intelligence and the sensory world and the mind of a bee. And I'm super excited about it because this is what I've been working on for about 30 years now. And so hopefully you'll be equally excited by the time the next half hour is over. So what is this about? So there's just a few glimpses of what I think is relevant for exploring the mind of an animal. There are many things that people mean by having a mind. I only focus on a few of them in this talk. So in the widest sense, this is going to refer to mental representations of things, of space, and of things in space. I will explore if bees can flexibly look into the past, if they have flexible access to autobiographical memories that they can retrieve. I will ask if they can look into the future, if they have an appreciation of the outcomes of their own actions. And perhaps most contentiously, I'll explore if they have emotions, feelings in the widest sense. So all of this might sound a little strange at this moment, but wait until I'm through. So there is a traditional view, I think. People are aware that social insects such as bees and termites can do wonderful things. Here is a comparison between the outcome of termite architecture on the left and a famous cathedral, La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And you can see that at least superficially, these two structures look remotely similar, but the thinking is that they come about by entirely different processes in the human world and in the insect world. That in the human world, you have a top-down architecture by which there is some mastermind who's dreaming up a plan and then handing down instructions to more or less specialized workers to execute these instructions according to the plan so that ultimately the outcome looks like the pre-planned product. Whereas, so is the thinking, at least historically in insects, everything arises by interactions between individuals that are by and large operating by robotic principles, that no individual has any kind of plan or oversight about the emergent structure. They're all equipped with a large repertoire of behavioral routines, sort of like a Swiss army, where they can activate one or the other behavioral routine depending on the stimuli that they currently find. And in that world, the insect lives entirely in the present. It doesn't look into the past. It doesn't look forward. It just responds to the conditions that it currently finds around itself. And this is the idea that I want to, I guess I want to stir the pot a little bit and show you that this is not quite so simple. So when we ask questions about the mind of a bee, we have to ask, well, what does a bee need a mind for? What does she do? What are her day-to-day challenges? And these are illustrated in a simple sketch on the right side here. You have a hive and all kinds of flowers. And the first thing you need to be able to do perfectly, if you're a forager that has a home base, such as a hive, is you have to have a very good memory of where that home is. If you're a honeybee, you might fly 10 up to 13 kilometers away from that home, and you have to reliably find your way back to it, because otherwise, not only are your flower foraging efforts lost for the colony, but also you yourself will most likely die if you don't find your home. Many bees, I should say, we are mostly familiar with honeybees and bumblebees, but the vast majority of bee species are actually solitary. They're single mothers that construct a home by themselves. And if these should forget their home, then where their home is, then they automatically lose all of their offspring. Okay, so in biological terms, their fitness is reset to 0. So their spatial memory has to be highly precise. Now, in addition, they have to be careful shoppers in what I call the flower supermarket. That is, flowers are advertisement for products that are contained inside them that matter for a bee: nectar and pollen. Bees are very good at measuring the quality of nectar and the quantity, for example. So they will probe a number of different flower species, but then ultimately focus their foraging efforts just on those species that they as individuals have discovered as being the most rewarding. And so they have to compare different offerings that are out there on that market. Remember the price tag, so to speak. So how long does it take to fly there? How difficult is it to pry open the flower structure? And how much do I get for it? And for the best flowers that they found, they will remember the colors, the scent, the patterns, everything that's the advertisement that characterizes the product for the bee. So she will remember these. And we, in essence, in our work, capitalize on this readiness of the bee to learn things associated with nectar quality for all kinds of experiments. On the left here, you can see a bee being trained to recognize an image of a human face. You can see she's about to land on a platform on which there's a little droplet of sugar water. And that's all the training it takes. So we do that a few times. She lands every time in front of this human face. Then we can do a test, giving the bee a choice between this face and some other faces. And she will actually recognize that one face that was previously associated with reward. Doesn't mean that the bee recognizes it as a face. To a bee, in essence, this is a strange flower. It's a pattern that's associated with a reward, but she will remember it if she reliably finds rewards in front of it. And in a similar manner, the bees are very flexible at learning scents. They can learn all kinds of flower scents, but they can even learn turpentine or the smell of beer and so on, anything that predicts reward. Now, one thing that is very important in a bee's daily life is, as I said, spatial navigation. And it's easy to underestimate just how difficult it is to find your way if we mostly operate in urban human-made environments, because human cities are built often with the idea in mind of building buildings that are memorable, that are unique, that are distinguishable from other buildings. So even if you navigate a city that you've never encountered before, this is Shanghai, and you're there for the first time, maybe your phone is out of battery, you don't have a map, you don't speak the language, you can still navigate relatively easily because you can remember the shape of various buildings. Now, the bee world is closer to this, right? So nature has no landmarks that are built to be memorable. Many, many, many trees in this landscape will look more or less the same. Now imagine if you're a bee in this foggy landscape, this landscape actually contains lots of bumblebees and they will forage under such foggy conditions. Imagine your nest is under the tree marked by an arrow, only there, and you fly 10 kilometers away, find some good nectar, maybe on the right side behind that hill there, and then come back to exactly the same point in space to deliver the goods that you foraged for your offspring. And a bee might have to remember multiple locations, so a good pollen patch might be over on the left, and so on. So there's a lot of aliasing, lots of similarities between landmarks, no paths, no sat nav, you have to do everything by memory. Now, the way we study bees' spatial memory nowadays is with a device called harmonic radar. You can see it here rotating on the right. The bottom dish emits a certain frequency, which is picked up by the bee's transponder that it's carrying here on its back, transposed to a different frequency, which is then picked up by the top dish. And this antenna type transponder looks large, but it's actually very lightweight. It's about 15 milligram, which is about a tenth of what a bee can carry when she forages for nectar or pollen. So it's not actually that heavy compared to a bee's carrying capacity. And what we can do with this kind of technology is take a view from the cockpit of a bee onto its environment. We can actually see what the bee sees while she's flying along this three-dimensional trajectory that you're seeing here. You can see these curved or boomerang type structures are actually the bee's eyes. They're curved, they're looking all around to some extent. You can see that the view is very pixelated. So a bee's spatial resolution is not as good as humans, but she can see faster. She can process more information per unit time. And now with this technology, we confront the bee with various challenges. And one is the traveling salesman problem, which is a familiar problem from the human world, where a traveling salesman, as the name suggests, has to link a variety of cities, in this case, 5 locations, in such a manner that minimizes travel distance and travel time. And you can do that by putting a map in front of you and deciding which is most likely the shortest route. But the bee, of course, has no map to start with. She has to explore her environment in the first place. So the task here is to start from the hive, bottom left, to set out, find these 5 locations, then link them in an order that minimizes travel distance. And you can see a single track here. Green is early, yellow is in the middle, red is late. And this track is clearly not yet optimal, but that's because the bee is not very experienced yet. So let's have a look at what happens over time from a bee that's completely inexperienced to one that's becoming really good at the problem. So here she starts flying. She's discovered the first 2 locations. She continues exploring. And in a moment, she's found the second 2 locations, now the 5th. But you can see there's still a lot of exploration. We're now on her 12th flight from the hive out and back. And you can see that there's still exploration, but the trajectory gets more and more streamlined. The bee gets better and better, stops the exploring, and then just focuses all her foraging on just these 5 flowers until she's found the optimal route. So this kind of problem actually keeps supercomputers busy for days. Because you have to go through all the iterations to find the optimal problem, but bees can solve it with a brain no larger than the size of a pinhead. Now, what we're also interested in is when bees are left entirely undisturbed, how do they then explore, later exploit their environment? So what we're seeing here is a bee's maiden flight, the first flight ever, the first time she ever leaves the hive. And so here, this is sped up over 100 times. Otherwise, we'd be waiting a long time because this maiden flight takes 2 hours. And what you can see is that the bee loops in various directions from her hive, exploring its vicinity for floral resources and also to remember the landscape. And she comes back several times to near the hive, doesn't enter it, just to reassure herself, okay, I still know where my hive is, then flies out again on another excursion until she finally goes home. One thing that's interesting here is that the loops are always in different directions. So she remembers, okay, that part I've already seen, I'll go to another one now. Another is that during this early flight, there's a forest edge that she's discovered up here, and that will become relevant later in her life. We'll come back to that in a minute. On the next day, so this is day 2, and we're starting with flight 3 now, she does one more exploratory loop where she hasn't been before, now in a southwesterly direction. and then explores a bit more. And now she's found something. And then for several days, she does nothing but exploit a floral patch along this forest edge on the top left here. Just flies back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Then for a day or two, there was inclement weather, so the bee stayed at home. After that, she does a few more flights. Again, green is early, orange is late, red is at the end. She flies to this familiar patch at first on the top left, then goes back, flies out, and suddenly changes course halfway down one of these excursions and returns to a patch that she had only visited a single time 10 days earlier on her very first flight. So she activates a distant memory from the first excursion she's ever made after leaving the hive, then finds that there's now good forage there and spends the rest of her day foraging from that forest edge until during one regular flight, she just disappears, presumably having been eaten by a spider or an insectivorous bird. And that's the end of that bee's career. So this bee was very focused on that. It had just had one day of exploration, its first few hours. After that, it was very methodic in exploiting familiar patches. Other bees are individually different. Some are more exploratory through their entire lives. Others intermittently use exploratory activities and then return to exploitation of familiar patches. Now, in talking to many colleagues who work with the intelligence of supposedly really clever animals, primates, corvid birds, and so on, they always said, well, yes, of course, bees can remember spatial positions and flower colors and so on, because that's what they have to do in their daily lives. But so they said, we in our intelligence tests confront the animals with tasks that they have never encountered in nature before, because that's, so they said, the whole point of probing an animal's behavioral flexibility is to confront them with something that no ancestor has ever done before. And such a task is actually shown here. This is a string pulling task whereby artificial flowers are presented under a transparent table. And the only way for the animal, in this case a bee, to get to the reward, which is in this in one of these three nectar wells in the center of the blue discs, the only way to get there is to pull the string. And now let's see if a bee can do this. So this is the first bee, by the way, that Sylvain Alerme, in this case in my lab, ever trained. And here she goes. You can see she's still a little bit clumsy, but she clearly knows what she's after. And in the end, she's pulled out the flower and reached the reward. So this, when I first, somewhat flippantly actually in a meeting told our primate colleagues, I think our bees can do that. They all laughed and said, okay, now Lars has gone mad completely, but here you go. They can not only just use the string pulling task to get to the reward, but here we're probing the bees a little bit further. On the right, you can see that the flowers are deceptively close to the edge from which the bee should not be pulling because the string is interrupted. But this bee quickly inspected the situation, looked at the interruption there and thought, okay, this is not going to get me anywhere. I'm going to fly to the flower that I can actually pull, even though the string is longer. And remarkably, the bees do not have to be trained to pick the correct string. They do it after they know, they've learned to string pull before, but this is the first time they've been confronted with these interrupted strings, and she can do it spontaneously. Now, the list of animals that can do such things spontaneously is not very long. It's primates, end of list. It's been tested on dogs and corvid birds and dolphins, and they will fail such tasks unless they are specifically trained to solve them. And it seems that our bees can do it. This is work by Chao Wen in my lab. Here's a slightly different version of the task. On the left, you can see there's a short perpendicular string and a long diagonal string. And this bee is a little bit, she gives up quite quickly, so she tries two strings, but she always tries the correct one. It's also not an easy task because sometimes the bee slips on the surface, but now she's going to the last string here, bottom left, and pulls out the correct string to get to the flowers. So they're very good at this. Now, not only can they learn such tasks or comprehend the idea behind the nature of the tasks by themselves, but they can also copy each other. So here we have a bee marked with a red dot who is an experienced string puller, and the other bumblebee is one that has no experience with string pulling so far at all. So after this, the skilled demonstrator, as we call them, with the red dot, has pulled out the flower, the other bee is just scrounging. Okay, she's just helping herself to the nectar reward that's now been exposed and happily drinking the reward as well. And you can see, of course, the amount there is finite. Now the bees get a little bit antsy because they've actually drunken up the nectar. And the skilled bee is now going to quickly move over to the next flower, pull that one out. The inexperienced bee is still faffing about, trying to, there has to be something somewhere here. But eventually she also gives up and runs over to the skilled bee again to just scrounge on the work of what we call the experienced demonstrator. Now you do this a number of times, and the previously inexperienced bee can do it by herself. And can then in turn pass on the technique to further individuals in the colony. Now again, they've finished the nectar, and in a moment you can see that the skilled bee is pulling out the next flower. Again, the unskilled one has no idea yet what to do, but she will learn it eventually. And doing this, you can monitor the spread of the string pulling technique in the same way as you can monitor how a meme spreads on social media in the human domain. So what we've done here is we have lots of little dots arranged in a circle. Each dot is one individual bumblebee of a colony. And at the top, our yellow individual was the one that we had trained first, the one that mastered the skill as the first individual. All the other ones are individuals. So the lines that are connecting that yellow dot with others means those two have done it together. They've been interacting with each other. And you can now see that a number of dots around the circle have turned orange. And these orange bees are all bees that have learned the technique from the yellow bee. Okay, so that's our second generation of learners, if you wish. But however, you can now also see a purple individual on the bottom left. The number that counts up here is the number of pairwise interactions. There's now a second purple dot here. These are second generation learners that have no longer picked up the technique from the yellow bee, but from the orange bees. And in fact, the technique continues to spread through the entire colony, even after the original trained individual has passed away. Bees only live for a few weeks, as I'm sure you know, but the technique continues spreading in this colony even when the original one is already no longer amongst us. And so it's a culture-like phenomenon in that there is a new technique that spreads between individuals, and we can monitor and quantify this spread until it reaches basically every bee in the colony. And what you get then is this highly sped up interaction here between multiple skilled string pullers, where you can see that they're working jointly together on pulling out multiple strings to get access and then share the rewards subsequently. There's clearly an attraction to joining other bees and pulling strings together and pulling them all out, and then moving over to the next flower. Now, the next experiment is also a social learning experiment, but here we've played a trick on the information transmission. So first of all, in this case, the bees no longer have to move an object that's somehow connected to the reward, but they have to move a detached object, very much like a token use in the human domain, or a form of tool use, if you wish, at the most basic level. The idea here is that this little ball that you see on the left needs to be moved into the yellow circle in the center for the bee to obtain its reward. And so here she goes, she rolls it backwards. So not like these beetles that move down. So she rolls it backwards, and then she gets the reward in the center through an automated mechanism from underneath. And now we asked again if bees might be able to learn this technique from a skilled demonstrator, even if they're entirely naive. But here we played a little trick on this interaction. So you can see there are now 3 balls, each at a different distance from that yellow goal circle in the center. And of course, in theory, the best way to solve the task would be to take the closest ball because it's closest to the target, so least effort. And however, the skilled demonstrator, which is the bottom central bee here, has been trained that the 2 closest balls cannot be moved. They're glued to the surface. So she knows I can't move these. I've tried many times, so I'll just move the furthest ball. And this is therefore what the observer bee gets to see. And so here's one such interaction. So again, the bee rolls it backwards to the center, and both of the bees now get a little reward. By the way, you can see here the little number tags on the backs of the bee. So this is how we can easily identify them and know which bee has which experience. And so here they're now happily drinking the nectar together. But this observer bee has never rolled a ball for a reward. So the question now is, after we did this 3 times, we have 3 demonstrations, and 3 times the demonstrator bee has solved the task in a suboptimal way by moving the distant ball to the center. Question is, what does the observer do when she's now put on the spot by herself? And how will she solve this task? And she picks the closest ball. You can see she's super clumsy because she has no experience yet actually with ball rolling, but she gets it there and spontaneously picks the closest ball. And that indicates to us that she is not merely aping the demonstrator. She's not just stupidly imitating the actions that she has seen lead to a reward, but it indicates to us that there is a form of outcome awareness, of understanding what this task is about. And so the bee, in a sense, plans accordingly and picks the closest ball rather than just copying what she's seen our demonstrator bee do. Now, another question that will also involve balls is the question of whether bees actually have mental representations of objects in their mind. Now, we already know that bees are very good at recognizing flower shapes. Here's again a bee simulation, a view through the bee's eyes onto the flower as she's scanning the flowers. But actually demonstrating that the bee is memorizing the flower features in a kind of mental representation is surprisingly difficult, because you can actually demonstrate that with so-called simple feature detectors, detector nerve cells that just focus on edge orientations or colors or color areas, you can actually do quite a lot of this recognition without having a little virtual image of a flower floating in your head, so to speak. And so one way of asking whether there is this kind of shape recognition by means of a mental representation is cross-modal shape recognition. What do I mean by that? I mean that you have access to a representation from multiple sensory dimensions, in this case, vision and touch. And the idea here is we have 2 kinds of objects. One is rewarding, the other is not. In this particular case, the bee that you see here, she's learned that balls are rewarding, cubes are not. Another group of bees does the reverse of the task. They learn that the cubes are rewarding and the balls are not. But let's focus on the ball learning bees here. Now, the trick we're playing here is that this bee cannot touch these balls. What might be slightly difficult to see is that there is a plexiglass lid over the edge of the object, so they can't actually touch it. They can only see the cubes and balls, and this bee has learned that she gets a reward on the ball shape. Now we test the same bees in complete darkness. By the way, this does not involve any animal cruelty. Keeping bumblebees at times in complete darkness is perfectly normal because they live in dark nests. And so in this case, in the dark scenario, the bees are allowed to touch the objects, but they can now not see them because it's pitch dark. This is we use infrared footage to monitor the bees' behavior. And spontaneously, after they've been trained to recognize balls, round things by vision, they pick the round things when they can touch them. And conversely, if we first train them in the dark so that they can touch the objects but not see them, again, here's a bee hugging a ball and collecting a reward from a nectar reward from the center of the flower. And we then subsequently test the bees that have been trained in this way under a look but don't touch scenario, where the objects are now visible but no longer touchable. And indeed, again, the bees recognize the correct objects. And this cross-modal shape recognition indicates to us that indeed there is a kind of mental representation that's accessible from both modalities. The task is to some extent similar to what kids at least sometimes used to do at birthday parties, where you had to reach into a bag with your hand and identify certain objects that the kids had previously only seen, but then doing it by touch and having to identify them by simple feeling. Now, perhaps to the most difficult question, do insects have emotions? And one thing, by the way, I do in my book a lot is to point to the historical dimensions of such research. And one scholar whose name deserves highlighting in this context is Charles Turner, an African-American animal psychologist who was active around the end of the 19th, early 20th century, who is remarkable in multiple ways. He was found it because of his ethnicity impossible to find, he could not get a job at a major research university. So he did his research while being a teacher at a high school, a special high school for Black children, with no resources, no team to help him, no access to a major library. And doing that, he published over 70 articles, some in the most highly regarded scientific journals, and whose insights were very visionary. And in that his work was contrasted with especially the view that all animal learning is associative and simple. Charles Turner believed and had experimental evidence that there is quite a bit of insight and intelligent problem solving in all kinds of animals, including insects. And he also thought that insects might have emotions. So here, this is one of the photos from one of his studies, and he observes that the coiled antenna, the protruding mouthparts, and the general attitude indicate intense excitement. One who believes that insects have emotions will find much in the attitude of these two Amorphilas to support his view. Now, how can one test emotions experimentally? So if you had asked me 15, 20 years ago, do insects have emotions, I would have probably laughed or thought that the person asking might be kidding me, but our minds also changed a little bit with the many experiments that we did. And one experiment that nudged our thinking in the right direction, I think, was one where we explored whether bees are capable of learning about predation threat. So everything I told so far, the bees had to learn things that were linked to a reward, but they can also learn, of course, about scary things. But we didn't know that yet 15 years ago. So one of the threats that bees regularly have to confront are sit and wait predators, spiders that prey on flowers. And some of these species, almost like a chameleon, can adopt the color of a flower. So they hide themselves very well. They can be either yellow or white, Some of them can also do pink. And we took this situation into the laboratory to see how bees might respond to it. And you can see here on the right, we have 2 life-size models of such spiders. And there are 2 sponge pads either side of this reward hole. They're very soft, so nothing bad happens to the bee, but it's a simulated predation attack by which we wanted to find out if bees can learn about it. Here's a little video of a bee flying in such artificial meadow. So she's now landed on a safe flower, but she's now going to make a mistake. She's landing on a dangerous flower. And she's briefly caught and then released. So the bee is clearly annoyed by this, as you can tell from her buzzing sound, but nothing bad happens. I can assure you there's no injury at all. But it's similar to being briefly captured and then escaping from a predation threat. And it turned out that bees do not only learn to subsequently avoid such flowers, but their whole demeanor changed. So they would inspect every flower extensively before deciding to land. So you can see one of these flight tracks where she's hovering in front of the flower before discovering that there's a spider and flying away. So they can learn about these threats. But what was even more strange or surprising for us, because I think it indicates a response that is way more advanced than you might think of, something that responds simply in a reflex-like manner to threat. So not only did their flight behavior change even days after such a simulated predation attack, but the bees even displayed what we call false alarms. That is, they sometimes scanned the flower and there was no spider there, and nonetheless they rejected the flowers after inspection. So they were almost seeing ghosts. They behaved in a sense like a human under a post-traumatic stress disorder. So they responded to a stimulus that wasn't there. They inspected flowers that were perfectly safe and still going, this doesn't look quite right, I'm going somewhere else. And that made us think in the direction already that there might be some truly emotional kinds of processes in bees. And we decided later to focus on positive aspects of bees' possible emotions and try to induce a happy state. And we used a kind of glass half full, glass half empty type of question. You know this question from the human domain. Here's a glass that's actually filled 50% with water. And you ask a human being who's optimistic, and they will say, well, it's pretty much half full. It's there's still a lot in there. And someone who is in an unhappy state will diagnose the same condition as in a pessimistic manner and will say, oh, it's already close to empty. Okay, so the same stimulus and different responses depending on your mind state, on your mood. And we're adopting here a behavioral paradigm that's borrowed from domestic animals, where you ask if your goats or sheep or domestic pigs are kept under happy conditions that induce a positive emotion state, or not so good conditions. We just adapted the paradigm for the world of bees. So here's a little flight arena, and you can see there are 5 entrances on the back, and during each flight, there's only one open. So let's say there is blue on the left, as you can see in the top right panel, panel B, then there's a reward, okay? So the bee learns whenever there is blue, I'll get a reward. On the other hand, if there's green on the right, I get no reward. And then after they've learned this, they learn blue is good, green is bad, we give them ambiguous stimuli in the middle, ambiguous stimuli in that they're in the middle between what the bees know as rewarding and unrewarding. And this is the bees' responses after training. So if they know blue's good, they'll fly there right away. 10 seconds, they go straight, fly to that target. If we present them with only green, they'll still eventually go there, but only after 1 minute, 2 minutes even, they're faffing about, they're going, I know this isn't rewarding, I've tried this many times before. And in the end, you go, all right, well, if they're not going to show me any blue, then I'll accept that green, but after a much longer delay. And now the question is, what do the bees do with the ambiguous stimuli? This is now our glass 50% filled. And we had a little experimental manipulation in that one group of bees, before they were being tested, got a little surprise reward. They got 5 microliters, that's a very tiny amount of sugar solution in the run-up to the test, and the control group did not. And we then asked, how do you judge this ambiguous stimulus depending on whether you've received a surprise reward? And here are some of the data. So this is my only data slide. I promise most of this is really not too data heavy, but so I'll talk you briefly through this slide. On the left, the P is the positive option, blue, and it's the response time. You can see it's only on average 10 seconds and the bee will land. On the right, negative, that's our green option. The bees take, well, almost 2 minutes on average before accepting that option. The interesting thing is what happens with the intermediate options. And you can see that there are 2 curves here. And the red curve are the intermediate options when the bee prior to the test has got a surprise reward. And for all intermediate options, the bee responds faster. She accepts the ambiguous, the neutral stimulus in the middle more readily if she's been put into a kind of positive, optimistic state by this extra reward than if she's had no such reward. That's the black curve on the right. So the bees behave exactly in the same kind of optimistic bias kind of way as a happy domestic animal behaves when they are kept under favorable conditions. So by the same criteria, we're not lowering the bar for our bees because we're fascinated by bees. We're using the same criteria as people use for domestic mammals, and the bees qualify. So by these criteria, there is indeed a positive emotion-like state in the bees. So briefly to wrap up, I think we have learned in this presentation that bees have mental representations of space, of things in space, that they can learn by observation and use tools, objects in a manner that indicates what we call intentionality, which means understanding the desirable outcome of the actions. They have flexible access to past memories, as I showed with the spatial navigation experiment, have an idea of what they want and mentally explore solutions to get there, using some sort of awareness of the possible outcomes of their actions, and act accordingly. And by the same criteria as have been used by other people for other animals, they appear to attach emotional states to rewarding conditions and also to punishment. So these are all key ingredients of a mind, and that's why I've now become presumptuous enough to call a whole book The Mind of a Bee. So if this has been of interest, so might the book. I also think perhaps as a final point that there are important ethical implications of the work that we and others have done, in that we are all aware that bees are in trouble, and we think that they need conservation because we need their services as pollinators for our food and our garden flowers and so on. But I think a slightly different angle is entirely used for conservation of big glamorous mammals such as Siberian tigers, because we empathize with them. We think they must suffer from the decline of their habitat and from the fact that there are fewer of them around them. And we've always thought, I think, or most of us, that insects don't merit the same kind of sympathy. But I think perhaps the work that is now available on bees' emotional states hopefully will also change that picture. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you have, then I think you will find the book entertaining as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lars. That was utterly fascinating. And yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the book, having had the chance to read it over the last few weeks. So thanks very much. And yeah, now we'll move on to the questions and answers. So hopefully we'll have time to go through quite a few of them. But the first question is from Steve, who asks, how do the bees resolve any territorial disputes?
That's a very good question. It depends on the species of bees. Mostly, of course, we view bees as relatively peaceful animals, especially compared to perhaps wasps. But it's the world of bees is not quite so peaceful as we often think it is. Even in the familiar honeybees, they are opportunistic foragers that try to get their rewards with at the least effort. And so there are often incursions of bees trying to steal nectar from other hives. And typically the guard bees will try to prevent them from doing that. But depending on how much surplus food there is in the environment, that can result in quite fierce battles at the hive entrances. There are tropical bee species that specialize in robbing other nests. So they're called kleptoparasitic bees because most of what they do is actually raiding the colonies of other bees. So there's active warfare going on in some of these tropical stingless bee species in these cases. There are also sometimes competitions for nesting sites in which nest-founding queens might attack each other and fight and so on. So there's all kinds of conflict when it comes to deciding who gets to live where and who gets to forage where.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Britta, who asks, what made the bees realize they need to move the ball to the target to get the reward?
Okay, so there are various ways to train them, and the most efficient one is the bees learning from each other. That works in the quickest way. The way we trained them to get the first bees to learn the technique is that we had a little dummy bee on a glass stick, and that dummy bee moved the ball in front of an aspiring ball roller gradually to the target region, and that way we trained that bee. We also had some experiments with what we call ghost bees, where the ball is magnetic, and we had a little magnet underneath the horizontal surface to roll the ball, and that also works to some extent, but the most efficient way is another bee showing the naive individuals how to roll a ball.
Amazing, thanks very much.
Right.
And another question is, do bees nurse injuries in themselves or others?
Very good question. So it was thought until not so long ago, actually, that bees not only lack pain, but that they also lack basic nociception, which is just a reflex-like response to injurious or at least potentially injurious stimuli. There was a thinking that insects just ignore that. The famous Nobel laureate Calvin Frisch even claimed that you could while a bee is drinking nectar, that you could cut off her entire abdomen and she wouldn't notice. She would just continue drinking. And of course, that's fairly preposterous. So certainly bees and other insects, I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever done any fishing or observed it, but most insects, when you impale them on a fishing hook, will struggle in the same kind of manner as a human might in a similar situation, minus the vocal vocalizations that might accompany that. So they certainly try to avoid injury. And so we have done some work with moderately noxious stimuli. That is, we've used a heated probe to touch a bee in various places. And quite clearly, they not only respond to that, but they also groom the location of the site and also try to avoid it subsequently. So there is, I think, good evidence now for pain perception in bees and other insects. And so I think these historical views of insects as not responding to or even having the neural equipment for sensing and subsequently avoiding injurious stimuli, that picture needs to be revised as well.
Thanks very much. And our next question is from Ellen, who asks, why are you using / training bumblebees and not honeybees in the experiments?
We do both. Most or all of the work in this particular presentation was was bumblebee focused, and bumblebees have certain advantages. That is, one, we can keep them through the entire year. They're in the laboratory, they're also active during the winter months. And that just stretches the period during which we can perform experiments. Another is that bumblebees are quite content to forage in laboratory settings where we can control the experiences of the bees prior to any experiment. And honeybees require some free flight on the way to our learning experiments. So in some cases which require careful monitoring of the experiences encountered by the bees, bumblebees are favorable. But we often, in many other experiments, have also looked at honeybees, and honeybees also have unique advantages, one of them being their famous symbolic language, the dance language by which they can communicate about foraging locations, which the bumblebees do not do. They don't have such a symbolic language. And so for certain experiments, we also use honeybees. And we're also very interested, by the way, in the construction abilities inside the hive, which of course in honeybees reaches an unrivaled sophistication with their double-sided, highly regular hexagonal combs that are also mathematically optimal for generating storage space, but while minimizing materials.
Thanks very much. I'll just find another question very quickly. Thanks very much, everyone, for all your questions. They are very fascinating.
Yes, indeed.
We have one from, I believe their name is Marcio. Apologies if I've mispronounced that. But the question is about visual models that Lars presented. How do you see what they're seeing, and how do you model such a field of vision, is what I believe they're trying to say.
Yeah, so we have from other labs work fairly detailed insights about the optical geometry of a bee eye. So of course their eyes are composed of several thousand facets, each of which has their own little lens, and they're all looking in slightly different directions. And each of these facets contributes essentially 1 pixel to what a bee sees. So from the geometry of the eye optics, when we know which position a bee is in and what height she is in, we can reconstruct what she sees from that particular point in space. And there's quite detailed information also from other labs about the neural processes analyzing the incoming visual information and how and what features are distilled to be sent on to the brain. And we can incorporate this information also into our models to see not just what the bee sees, but also what information reaches the brain while she's flying out and exploring her environment or flying to familiar flower patches and so on.
Thank you very much. I'm aware of the time, so we'll just have one more question. There's one from Rihanna who asks, is there learned knowledge only ever passed on through copying and observing, or is it possible that these behaviors could become inherited?
That's a very good question. I don't know is the honest answer, but I've been very, very fascinated by this possibility because what we historically think is going on with all the remarkable constructions that bees build, and that's not just our familiar honeycombs. There are very elaborate constructions by tropical stingless bees where there's variation. Some build spiral-shaped combs, some horizontal ones, some build actual fake nests to fool predatory insects that enter the nest, where they contain diluted nectar and fake brood pots and so on. So there are amazing innovations in these architectures. There's variation within species, so not all colonies of the same species have the same architecture. And historically, we always thought, well, all of this is innate. They don't have to learn how to build any of this. But of course, given what we now know about the social learning abilities of bees and the problem-solving abilities, it is plausible that at least at some point in the distant past, some of these innovations were the result of individual innovation and subsequent cultural spread, and were later cemented by evolution into hardwired routines. So it's possible that in exploring truly cultural processes in these insects, is we're simply looking at the wrong time. We're looking at a time when they've already become hardwired, and at some point earlier on might have spread by social learning. It's plausible, at least.
Thank you very much. Well, I believe that's the end of the Q&A session. So I just wanted to extend our thanks to Lars Chittka for delivering this wonderful talk about the mind of a bee, and it's utterly fascinating. So thanks again for this evening. Your time is much appreciated.
Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for listening.
If you'd like to purchase a copy of Lars' book, The Mind of a Bee, with signed book plates, it will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. For more information on book sales, please see the festival website or head direct to foxlanebooks.co.uk/festival bees. Festival ideas, sorry. That's a good idea, though. We very much hope that you will continue to be engaged with the Festival of Ideas. Check out the website yorkfestivalofideas.com for full details of all the events in the festival program. We'd love to hear from your thoughts on these events and continue the conversations using the hashtag York Ideas. Thanks very much.